So the peripheral nervous system, we're on page 249. So, and because of the vastness of the peripheral nervous system, and remember, we're talking about everything that's not the brain and spinal cord. Every aspect of your nervous system that's not the brain and spinal cord is the peripheral nervous system. You can kind of understand that there's a lot of stuff there and a lot of detail, and so that's why so much. But we'll get through it, and we'll make the test reasonable as well. So, page 249, and we lead off with neuron arrangements there, figure 9.1 of the SMNS and ANS, and we're going to introduce those right now. So, the bulleted points at the top, the peripheral nervous system, the P and S, can be split into two divisions. And this is going to happen. How many divisions are we going to go? But anyway, so you have the afferent neurons and the efferent neurons. Remember, the afferent neurons send signals from receptors to the central nervous system. So the signals that is being sent right now from my hand is that I have a cool, refreshing beverage and that I'm taking a sip of it. So, from the receptors on my tongue, down into my stomach, on my hand, we've sent signals to the central nervous system. The efferent neurons send signals from the central nervous system to the effectors, and so they do that via two different things: the somatic motor nervous system, the SMNS, and the autonomic nervous system, the ANS. So the somatic motor nervous system, you can probably guess, is going to be the one you control, and the autonomic is the opposite. So the SMNS, the somatic motor nervous system, controls the skeletal muscles. That is the voluntary muscles. It's the ones that you choose to use. A single neuron whose cell body is housed in the central nervous system extends from the spinal cord to the effector. The neuron axons are myelinated. This is an excitatory system. It can only excite the effectors and uses only the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So you see the distinction there at the bottom of page 249 between the somatic motor nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Oh, it's going to be a good day today. So, and you see the differences in terms of the pathways. You notice the nerve in terms of innervating that muscle there, and then, as we will discuss in just a second, you have the autonomic nervous system that controls the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, and the glands. These things are involuntary. Conscious thought can affect but not control. And again, I've used this illustration, but let's see, what was the question last hour? I can't remember what the question was. But anyway, so I date myself when I use these illustrations, but tough, all right? Has anybody ever heard of not just the practice, the discipline of Kung Fu, but the TV show Kung Fu? Has anybody ever watched Kung Fu? My illustrations are just lost. Anyway, so in the 70s, there was this popular TV show. This guy from China, and he practices Kung Fu. He's a man of peace, but he's always whipping these cowboys that he comes in contact with that are the mean guys. And at one point, he gets captured, and they put him in a hot box. And this is from an episode that I remember from a long time ago, and there's not many, but this one I do. So they put him in a hot box, and he's in there, and it's extreme heat. And he sits there quiet, more or less meditating, in the meditating position of Far Eastern religion. And so they come in and they check on him, and they check his pulse, and they say he's dead. Oh, he's died, he's dead. And so they drag him out and they throw him to the side or something like that. And then, of course, he revives because he's the star of the show. He can't die. So, but the idea there was that based on his kung fu technique, his Eastern meditation, he was able to slow down to the point of virtually stopping his heart rate. All right. And I always thought that was an interesting thing, even though it just doesn't happen to be true. You can affect your heart rate. You can relax, and there are techniques that do and are successful to help us relax and slow our heartbeat, but not to the point of stopping it or even close to stopping it. Again, it's autonomic. So conscious thought can affect it somewhat, but not control. There's two neurons extending from the spinal cord to the effector. There's the preganglionic neuron. The cell body is housed in the spinal cord or the brainstem. And so, let's go ahead and kind of look here. You see in terms of what we're talking about in terms of the ANS, the little neuron extended from the spinal cord all the way out, and you notice in terms of the neurons that there's two of them, the preganglionic autonomic nervous system neuron and the postganglionic. Those, again, I'm looking at page 249 in the little drawing at the bottom, and you see the postganglionic autonomic nervous system neuron interfacing there with the smooth muscle. The preganglionic neuron cell body is housed in the spinal cord or brainstem, while its myelinated axon extends into the body. It uses acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter, and it synapses with the postganglionic neuron at an autonomic ganglion. The cell body of the postganglionic neuron resides in the autonomic ganglion, and its non-myelinated axon extends to the effector using norepinephrine as a transmitter. It can be excitatory, in other words, excite the smooth muscles of the stomach during digestion, and inhibitory. In the same example, it inhibits the stomach contraction when you are exercising, playing, working, whatever else. So the differences there, note the difference in the single axon extending from the central nervous system, in this case the spinal cord, to the skeletal muscle on the somatic nervous system, and then the two of them there in terms of the autonomic nervous system. So if you would turn over to the next page, so figure 9.2, and we have pretty drawings of the spinal cord there. And so, like I said, we're going to be doing lots of division in this particular module. Not the mathematic kind, but the dividing kind in terms of characterizing. So there are divisions of autonomic nerves in the autonomic nervous system, and there are at least two, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. So the sympathetic division, and again on page 251, figure 9.2, there they are depicted for us. In the sympathetic division, depicted on the left, it arouses the body. It increases the rate and strength of the heartbeat and blood pressure. It stimulates the liver to release glucose into the blood. So you obviously need food to run your muscles. And that's what the sympathetic division does. It arouses the storers of glucose. Has short preganglionic neurons and long postganglionic neurons. And see how they're depicted there. So you see the short preganglionic neurons. They're depicted there in the nerves that come off of the central nervous system spinal cord, and you see they're just real short. They're real small. Look at the one at the bottom that goes to the genitals and bladder. So it's very short, and then you have a long, in terms of the postganglionic neuron that reach from the ganglions to the organs, diverging and innervating a range of effectors. And so that's what's also depicted there in terms of that postganglionic neuron. Notice it's going to, in this instance, it's going to the genitals and the bladder and also into the digestive system. All the nerves come from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord and are located in different parts of the body. So notice that too in terms of the two sections of the spinal column. It's all of the sympathetic division neurons are coming from both the thoracic and the lumbar. So and again, that's depicted there, including the ones all the way up to the eye. The parasympathetic division slows stuff, all right? It slows the heart rate. It lowers the blood pressure. It does housekeeping activities, such as causing the stomach's smooth muscles to churn and digest. So again, that's perhaps the easiest way to distinguish these two. The sympathetic division arouses. The parasympathetic division sleeps or slows. Has long preganglionic neuron and short postganglionic neuron. So notice that there in terms of the parasympathetic division. You have long preganglionic neurons and shorter postganglionic neurons, and they don't diverge very much. So they just go to one particular effector, to the salivary glands or to the lungs in that instance. The nerves are found in the brainstem and the sacral regions of the spinal cord and are located in the head and trunk only. So just an interesting aspect there, and you see it coming off there of the brainstem and then down there at the sacrum as well. So just kind of interesting distinctions there. All right, questions about that wonderful stuff? All right, let's move on. Bottom of your page 1 of your terms. The functions of the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. So functions controlled by both. So in some instances, both of them are involved in the same function. The organs and muscles which control these functions must be innervated with neurons from each division. So the heart, the sympathetic division, sends out potentials that action potentials that increase the rate and force of cardiac muscle contraction. The parasympathetic division nerves send action potentials which slow the rate of cardiac muscle contraction. These balance one another based on need. So if you have a need to run and go fast, then you know that the sympathetic division is going to activate, and likewise, when it's time, when you're tired, when you're worn out, and you need to rest, then again, the parasympathetic division is going to kick in. In terms of breathing, the sympathetic nerves and action potentials cause the bronchial tubes to dilate, to grow in diameter, in other words, allowing more air into the lungs, supplying more oxygen to tissues. The parasympathetic division sends action potentials that constrict the bronchial tubes so less air is taken in. Likewise, the digestive system. The sympathetic division nerves slow digestion activity, while the parasympathetic system increases the digestive muscular activity. The salivary glands. The sympathetic division inhibits saliva production. So, any of you here do any public speaking? Anybody? Sorta? Yeah. So have you ever had dry mouth as a result of that? No? Good. So you don't get too nervous when you stand in front of folks. Not too bad. Yeah. Oh my, the first few times I tried that, and especially, it still happens. I've only been doing this for, 35 years in terms of preaching and teaching, including seminary. But when I get in front of certain folks, I'll still end up with dry mouth. And why exactly is that? Well, the sympathetic division inhibits saliva production. So when you're nervous and you have a lot of activity going on elsewhere, well, it's going to inhibit the saliva production. And so I don't drink this for that reason necessarily. I just, like Matthew McConaughey said, I just like it. So, but anyway, the parasympathetic division causes more secretion of saliva. Vision. The sympathetic division dilates the pupils to let more light in, while the parasympathetic division contracts the pupil to reduce the amount of light entering the eyes. The sympathetic division also relaxes the muscle controlling the eye's lens, allowing distant vision, while the parasympathetic division contracts that muscle so that the lens becomes more round and allows up-close vision. Just a reminder, and it's got nothing to do with much, but it is a reminder. In a medical terminology class I had in college, I hated every bit of it, but I had to take it. And since in various classes, there's something that infuriates apparently, in quotes, medical professionals. And that's when you say something dilates, all right? Dilates, all right? Because that's the way you look at the word dilates and you think dilates. Well, they hate it when you say that stuff. It's not dilates, it's dilates, all right? There's no A in there. But a lot of us used to use that word until you had teachers come along and climb all over your case for saying dilates. So anyway, just a reminder, that way you don't get into trouble. Finally, urination. Sympathetic division relaxes the bladder and allows it to fill, while the parasympathetic division contracts the bladder for urination. Both divisions play a role in reproduction. So you see there's many functions in terms of your body that both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic division are involved. But then there are unique functions that only one is involved. So these are the functions controlled by the parasympathetic division. The structures which control these functions are innervated by only parasympathetic division nerves. The lacrimal glands in the eyes produce tears. They're always producing tears, as a matter of fact, to keep the eyes moist, and as we discussed a time or two, to disinfect the stuff that comes flying into your eyes. The tears are always draining. Crying is the result of greater tear production. It is also, though, a parasympathetic function. So unless you have a syndrome known as dry eye, and it's just that simple, where your lacrimal production has been for some reason stunted, you are constantly producing tears. Incidentally, that does go down as you get older. I wear something called hard contact lenses. Once again, I'm no doubt, unless you have a parent that still wears these things, but so it's hard pieces of plastic that go over the eye. You put these little soft things in your eyes, and maybe the first time they ever put them in, you blinked for a time or two, but then you immediately became accustomed to them for the most part, because they're mostly water, as a matter of fact. And that's the case for most contact lenses these days. But I continue to wear these things that I got when I was 12 years old. They're called hard contact lenses. And they're just solid pieces of plastic, thin obviously, and small, but it's what I've always worn, and now my eyes are used to them. However, these things, when I got these things, so you had to step up in terms of how long you wore them. The first day you wore them for 2 hours. And for 2 hours, the first time I put these things in my eye, you had to be dedicated, I might add. I blinked. I literally, 2 hours. I'm doing this, all right? Could hardly see anything. Next day, it was 3 hours. 3 hours of this, all right? And then the day after that, 4 hours. You're stepping up in terms of your eyes accustoming. 4 hours of this. Next day, 5 hours. And it started to decrease a little bit. I was a little bit better. Next day, 6. You're stepping up. And it was even better. And by the end of the week, maybe a little bit further, I was pretty much used to them. And so, but the point of this is, they're hard pieces of plastic. There's no water involved with these things other than the wetting solution you might put on them that helps them attract water or moisture from tears from your eyes. The older you get, you lose the ability to produce tears, as much tears. And so the point of all of that silly, stupid story is to tell you that my contacts are getting foggy and messy and nasty a lot of times throughout the day. So I have to take them out and wash them now, where I didn't need to used to do that years ago, wear them all day long and see just fine. All right, that was a long day to go for not much of a story, but anyway, not much of a story. Functions controlled by the sympathetic division. Structures which control these functions are innervated by only the sympathetic division. And so in terms of those things, we're thinking blood vessels. The sympathetic division innervates and dilates blood vessels in the skeletal muscles, allowing blood to flow more freely. It stimulates the liver to increase glucose release into the blood. It constricts the skin and contracts erector pili. Those are the muscles that make goosebumps. The sympathetic division offers redundancy. That's duplicate control. For example, stimulation of kidneys to produce and secrete hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine causes the liver to release even more glucose and dilates the blood vessels. Epinephrine and norepinephrine cause the heart rate to increase. These are effects that the sympathetic division directly creates as well. So you got both. You got the sympathetic division stimulating aspects of your anatomy that coincide with what it's doing directly, and in that instance, in terms of heart rate. It stimulates hormones to prolong the effect. Think elevated heart rate and anxiety for some time after a scary event. It takes time for the body to get rid of those hormones. So if I told you my car accident story, have I told you that story? Somebody nod your head if I did, so I don't go into this deal. No? So anybody here been driving and had an accident? Have you? So was it bad? I hope obviously not. You're fine. So, but after that accident, did you feel any different?
Yeah.
What did you feel?
Fear to get behind the wheel again.
Say what?
Fear to get behind the wheel again.
Yeah, yeah. How about you, Madeline? Do you feel any different? It right away. Any feelings different? Say what?
Well, we got in an accident when I was younger.
Uh-huh.
It was really scary. It wasn't too bad, but like our whole back of our van was like all compressed.
Uh-huh.
But it was just very like anxiety-inducing for like a few days.
Yeah. So, sadly, I've had more than one accident. and some of them, none of them severe. I've never had to go to the hospital or anything, no concussions. But enough to deploy airbags and things like that. And, you know, somebody pulls out in front of you and you slam, you slam on the brakes, here comes the airbag, you know, and busts out. And again, I hope you guys haven't experienced that. I hope you never experience that. But the airbag blows out, and however you have your hands on the wheel, it's going to affect them. And so scratch my hands. But anyway, you know, you come to a stop and you're looking around, make sure you're okay and everything, and heart rate is racing. And so you know, I can remember distinctly trying to think of what do I do now, and where is my you know, car information, insurance, stuff like that. What do I do now? In other words, confused thinking, which is the result of the release of those hormones, those fight or flight hormones, and it's stuck around. In other words, fine, you're excited as a result of the accident, but in terms of being able to think clearly and to do what, and again, I wasn't in a basket case, but I noticed a difference in myself and thought, this is just really weird. Why am I feeling like this? And that's why I was feeling this way, because again, in terms of the release of those hormones and the control of the sympathetic division, the effect of that stuff was prolonged, and it happens in scary events. So, bulleted points. The sympathetic division is associated with functions related to anxiety or stress. Turns up heart rate, glucose level, blood vessel dilation, while turning down functions not associated with those functions, such as digestion. So the body can concentrate on activity. The parasympathetic division is associated with functions related to body rest. Turns down heart rate, glucose level, blood vessel dilation. No. Dilation. While turning up digestion and urination. All right, questions about the parasympathetic and the sympathetic division? Not a bad picture to draw, not necessarily that you have it on the test, but it is kind of interesting in terms of reminding yourself of this stuff. All right, so the control of the autonomic nervous system, autonomic reflexes, let's talk about those. Okie dokie. And if you would, 255 and or 256. It's kind of a chart there on 256 that may or may not be helpful. Some charts are helpful to me, some are not. I don't know about this one. So autonomic reflexes control whether the sympathetic or parasympathetic division is in control of a given structure. Sensory neuron sends information an association neuron to an association neuron. The association neuron interprets the information and initiates a signal in either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic division. The autonomic reflexes are coordinated in several regions of the central nervous system, including the medulla, the spinal cord, and the hypothalamus. These reflexes are also influenced by other parts of the central nervous system, such as the limbic system. The limbic system stimulates the sympathetic division to increase heart rate, release glucose, activate adrenal glands, making the body instantly ready for action. That's, again, the fight or flight reflex. The afferent division of the peripheral nervous system sends action potentials from the sensory receptors of the body, here we go, oh, yep, there's my forehead, to the central nervous system. The sensory receptor, that's an organ which responds to a specific type of stimulus by ultimately triggering an action potential. On a sensory neuron, the cochlea of the ear, for example, responds to vibrations in the air, or sound, that's what we're talking about, by triggering action potentials on a cranial nerve. Turn over to page 3, if you would. There are 3 main ways of classifying sensory receptors. There's the somatic receptors, there's the sensory receptors in the skin and muscles in terms of those locations, the somatic receptors. The visceral receptor is sensory receptors in the internal organs. And then there are special, very special receptors, sensory receptors in specific locations, including those for taste, smell, hearing, and vision. So that's classification of these receptors based on location. And then there's another classification, if you would. Yeah, there's no drawing of them, but the next couple of pages, I'm on page 258 if you like to follow along with your notes and the textbook. But the types of receptors include mechanoreceptors, and those are receptors that respond to movement. So you feel in the summertime that mosquito land on you, and you know he's there, and you want to get him, before he starts to take your blood. So that's a mechanoreceptor. The mosquito lands on your skin, moving the very delicate superficial touch receptors, incidentally, more so in various parts of the body, as you know. Hearing is the result of sound caused by vibrations, that's movement in the air. All right, so mechanoreceptors then are those that respond, as we've just said, to movement. There's thermoreceptors. Those are sensory receptors which respond to heat and cold. Heat receptors increase the frequency of action potentials, remember, not the intensity, but the frequency as they get warmer. Cold receptors increase the frequency of action potentials as they get colder. Are many more cold receptors than there are heat receptors. The photoreceptors, as you can envision, they are sensory receptors which respond to light, and they're located in the retina of the eye. There are chemoreceptors. Those are sensory receptors which respond to chemicals themselves. Think senses of taste and smell that way. Depending on what you put in your mouth, they respond differently. They are chemoreceptors that monitor pH and oxygen levels in the blood. So they vary, as you see, vastly. Nociceptors are receptors which respond to pain or excess stimulation. They respond to excess stimuli. In other words, all of the above receptors. The nociceptors add relating information based on too much in all of these instances. So a burn is too much of a chemical, right? Whether it's ultraviolet light, and you don't get much of a response while you're burning, but if there's too much of a chemical, the nociceptors respond. If the pitch is too high, that's too much movement actually in your ear. A physical burn is too much heat. So these receptors, as you can imagine, they have a high threshold. It takes a lot of heat for them to tell you it's too hot, all right? And the same thing with movement and chemical burn. So these things then can be classified as by location, as the type, and then one other classification, and that is simple or complex. All right? Even the simplest receptor is amazingly complex, but with that said, comparatively, simple receptors are relatively small and can be distributed more widely over the body, and complex receptors govern the 5 special senses, and that is taste, smell, hearing, balance, and vision. So if you think about those 5 senses, simple will cover everything else. All right? Bulleted points, just descriptive points with respect to this. Someone with a severed spinal cord at the waist, after a certain amount of healing, may move their toe in response to a pinch, and that's because of something we looked at last time, or maybe a couple of times ago, the reflex arc. The signal actually doesn't go to the brain, it can't, right? Because of the spinal cord injury. So you're not feeling the pain, but to the spinal cord and back to the toe goes that stimulus, and that's the reason for the movement, the slight movement. People do not possess sensory receptors for everything. The great example of that is X-rays. So you can stand around in the X-ray room, all day long, all week long, fat and happy. Oh, this is a fun time. Until time, and when you suddenly realize that you have been burned in a terrible way. For a receptor to respond to a stimulus, the stimulus must be greater than the receptor's threshold. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Some mosquitoes are too small to trigger the stimulus sufficient to stimulate the receptor. In other words, it was sub-threshold until that sucker, literally, the mosquito is a sucker, gets so filled with blood, and then you feel it, and then you got that mess all over the place. So, to be aware of a stimulus, the receptor must be stimulated above its threshold, and we've learned this as well. The receptor will then generate an action potential in the afferent neuron that is associated with that receptor. Action potentials will be conducted without decrease to the synapse in the spinal cord, which triggers action potentials on another neuron. That neuron will probably synapse with another neuron, which will then send action potentials and on to the next neuron. Ultimately, the message will reach a conscious center in the brain. Action potentials will be interpreted in the brain. They will bring awareness to the stimulus. Strong stimulus causes a high rate of action potentials on the sensory neuron, while weak stimuli cause the low rate of the same action potentials. So, an appropriate stimulus, and again, this is terminology, and okay, is the normal or appropriate stimulus for a receptor. Sometimes non-appropriate stimuli can stimulate a receptor. For example, and I would be shocked if not everyone in this room has had an ear infection at some point in their life. They cause pressure, and they cause receptors to produce action potentials that result in the sensation of ringing in your ear. Anybody had that? Anybody relate to that part of an ear infection? Yeah, isn't that something? Now, there's actually not a bell going off in your ear or in your room, but there is that sensation. And so the issue there it also happens with a hit on the head or intense motion can cause light receptors to be triggered so that you see stars. That's the other example. You know, the Looney Tunes cartoon when Porky Pig gets hit on the head and the stars are coming out and yeah, and all of those stars are coming. Well, you know, that's a real reaction. And for some of us anybody here had a concussion? Anybody seen stars? Did you see stars? You see the little sort of flashes of light? Those, again, they're triggered as a result of the receptors being caused to affect, but you didn't actually see stars. I mean, there's not stars flying around your head. Projection is the role of the cerebral cortex that tells where a stimulus occurred. In other words, a bee sting on the hand sends the pain message to the part of the cerebral cortex that represents the hand. That's how you know where it was. Modality is the thin layers in the cortex. Each layer is stimulated by a different kind of receptor. So the mechanoreceptors, the thermoreceptors, etc. And then there is adaptation. The receptor physically stops responding or slows in its response if the stimulus remains constant. So anybody here insist on a real Christmas tree in your home? Anybody have real Christmas trees? All right, good. How come? Why do you like the real Christmas tree?
Smells good.
Smells good. Good. So you put that thing in there and you go in there and you love that smell. What happens as time goes on?
Pines fall off and you step on them and
You got to vacuum everything up. Well, you know, even with artificial trees, you vacuum everything up. Have you noticed that the smell seems to be less intense over time? Well, the reality is probably the smell is not necessarily less intense. It's just in terms of adaptation, you have smelled that particular smell, and so as a result, the stimulus remains constant, but you physically stop responding to it. Wearing a watch. So when you first put your watch on, anybody here wear a watch? That's going away too in terms of culture. Anybody wear a watch? Nobody wear a watch? I tell you how stuff changes. Yeah, you got your phone all the time, so you can ask it what time. That's what I understand. But, you put on the watch, and this is a big old heavy thing, and I don't know that it's there for most of the time unless I want to look at what time it is. You jump into a cold pool, not necessarily an ice cold pool, but when you jump into a cold pool, you're and then you move around a little bit. Well, and that's also the action of movement, but you get used to it, right? Again, all of these things, the amount of adaptation depends on the kinds of receptors. Pain receptors adapt very slowly. So, if it's painful in terms of something that's happening, it usually continues to be that way. And that's for a reason. Pain protects the body, right? So if something really hurts, it's the old adage, no pain, no gain, is not necessarily true with regards to your physicality. You can hurt yourself pretty good if you continue to do what is hurting. Adaptation is neat too with respect to eating. So you sit down with your delicious steak and your delicious baked potato and your asparagus or whatever it might be, and your fresh fruit and your delicious piece of bread. So a lot of us just eat one thing at a time and then we go to the next thing. But in terms of getting the fullest satisfaction out of your eating, with regards to adaptation, it says probably it's a better idea to have a bite of that steak, bite of them potatoes, whatever the order you want. But in other words, to move it around, because that way adaptation does not necessarily sort of sink in, and the tastes become sort of adapted to, and so they're not as vibrant, not as intense. I want to keep going just because of all the stuff. We got 3 minutes. I think we'll do the general senses. The somatic senses that are located in the skin, the muscles or tendons, and there's 2 types. There's cutaneous receptors, and in terms of those cutaneous receptors, there's 6 of those, I think, and then we're just going to do the cutaneous receptors. We won't do the proprioceptors. There's free nerve endings. That's the simplest, most common receptors. Nerves simply rise to the epidermis and branch out until they end. They can be either superficial or deep in the skin. These are receptors for heat, cold, movement, itch, pain, etc. Hair follicle receptors in the skin. The hair that grows out of the follicle is wrapped in a receptor. Moving the hair triggers an action potential on its associated neuron. The hair itself has no receptors. You don't feel any pain when your hair is cut unless they use dull scissors and it pulls on them. But the follicle does. So you can cut your hair and you feel no pain, but the movement of the hair produces a feeling. That's why I like to move my hair in the wind,
Your whole lot of zero hair.
Say what?
Your whole lot of zero hair.
Yeah, that's it, basically. Paxinian corpuscles are receptors found, they're like tiny onions associated with a sensory neuron. And if you would, I'm sorry, turn to page 262. I guess I am trying to hustle us. I haven't referred to the picture there, and this is actually a nice little picture. So we saw the free nerve endings, we looked at the hair follicle receptors. Notice where they are down in the follicle of the hair. The Paxinian corpuscles, they kind of look like little onions. You see them there, it's at the bottom. associated with a sensory neuron. They're pressure receptors. So if you push hard in terms of your skin, those are what activate. Ruffini's organs are found deep in the dermis. They respond to pressure on and stretching of the skin and respond to continuous touch or pressure. That's the Ruffini's organs, and you see those little things there, kind of look like a piece of cauliflower. Merkel's discs, in most superficial layers of the skin, they're tiny disc-like, and they respond to light touch, many of which are associated with the same neuron. They're able to respond to skin moves if it moves as much as 1/25,000th of an inch. So we're talking about a very sensitive receptor. And finally, the Meissner's corpuscles, found throughout the dermal papilla. Those are the bumps on your dermis. They are involved in the two-point discrimination. Fingers can distinguish between two toothpicks that are 0.5 centimeters apart, while legs cannot, because there's more receptors in the fingers than in your legs. So the tongue has the highest concentration of Meissner's corpuscles, so you can feel even the tiniest irregularity in your teeth. So doesn't it drive you nuts when you get a piece of popcorn kernel between your teeth? That sort of deal, because you can feel it, because of the number of receptors. And again, in terms of the toothpicks, if you've got two toothpicks 5 millimeters apart and you touch your fingers, you'll say that's 2 toothpicks. You try the same thing on your legs, you probably won't be able to tell the difference. We're done.